Well, good afternoon. I'm Michael Geary, the CEO of the Society for Marketing Professional Services. Thank you for being with us today. Before I say anything more, please, I wanted you to know that closed captioning is available for this program. And at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon for closed captioning. It might say live transcripts. So please click on that and it'll be automatically providing captioning for all of our speakers today. We're really glad to have you join us today. This is our 6th program speaking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, an initiative that SMPS started several years ago. And our mission here today and long-term is to ensure that we have a diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization, but also that we can help our members and their firms address issues of DEI, both for their employees, but also for their clients and generally for the culture in which they work. So we're so glad that you're here to support this program today. As I mentioned, this is one of many programs that we've been doing over the last year, and all of the other programs have been saved and are available on our website, smps.org/DEI. There you'll learn more about our efforts, and you'll also learn a little bit about our chairperson of our task force, Asheya, who will take over now as the moderator and host for today's program.
Thanks, Michael.
Asheya.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone for joining today. As Mike mentioned, we have been in a series of quarterly town halls to bring up diversity and inclusion issues. Today is our first deep dive into the equity issue, particularly as it concerns and relates to the built environment. So as each of us are soliciting projects, responding to project opportunities, developing teaming partners, and just creating spaces, we wanted to provide some context and understanding of the project environment that we're working in and how equity shows up historically, has shown up historically, and how that should impact the way that we're moving forward in our project selection. So I'm really excited about today's conversation. I think it's going to be a little bit of a deeper dive than what we've done previously, but I think it's really, really important as SMPS moves forward in terms of our DEI commitment. I think most everyone knows that we have had a sincere focus on developing a philosophy and approach for both our members as well as the AEC and commercial real estate environment moving forward. And so first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Destiny Thomas of the Thrivance Group. She is going to provide some historical context surrounding policy and systems that have impacted the built environment. When she completes her program or presentation, we will convene with our esteemed panelists who will then introduce themselves and enter into our panel conversation. Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Asheya, and thank you everyone for having me. I'm going to share briefly before we get into our panel discussion, some information that I think is appropriate context setting for the discussion that we're going to have. A little bit about me first. I'm born and raised in Oakland, California, the daughter of community organizers, and eventually found my way into founding my own company. It's called Thrivance Group. We're a for-profit urban planning firm that has 3 intentions. The crux of our work happens in the space that we call Thrivance Project, and that's where a lot of our client-based work happens. We also have Thrivance Legacy, which is our youth-based 501c3 iteration of the overarching goals and objectives of our company. And then we have Thrivance Place, which is a spatial expression and environmental expression of the values and objectives that we have as a company. And in each of those spaces, we do work in 4 ways. We conduct meaningful research. There's actually a research project that I'm excited to share more about later. But we also contribute to design build projects, as well as design and implement community engagement. And we also create and study policy interventions. As I mentioned a moment ago, we're a for-profit planning firm, and we work expressly in the interest of racialized people. I recognize that this is a very different vision or mission statement from what you may see from a traditional planning firm. And so I thought it was important to include this so that folks can see that this in and of itself is an example of a business model, business structure that still allows us to work in the built sciences, but also achieve some of the qualitative outcomes that often are left out of the work that we do as an industry. So we really see ourselves as an industry leader in establishing what we call transformative models for equitable land use. And we also see ourselves as an accountability partner in the urban and transportation planning spaces. And we directly work with policymakers, regulatory agencies, and civil service agencies. I want to start out by asking us to reflect on our goal, right? The E in DE&I means equity, right? And formerly, we used to refer to equity as equality. Now, I, as an anthropologist, understand that those two words have different meanings, but we should ask ourselves if the outcomes that we are achieving through the work that we do also assert that distinction. I found that equality as an aspiration fails to acknowledge or resolve any of the inherent inefficiencies, inequities, and dysfunction that exist within broader notions of society. And what I mean by that is a lot of times when we're striving for equitable or equal outcomes, we aren't addressing the root causes, the issues that created the inequities to begin with. The compounding impacts, in particular, of the legacy of anti-Black racism in the United States are such that even if we were to achieve equality, the effects of that would be null and void because we would not have addressed the effects of generations of racism across hundreds of years. And then lastly, the problem with the equality framing is that we are often situating our aspirations, right, around an outcome that mirrors or mimics another person or another group. And that other group is typically white people or the experience that white people are having. You'll often read about statistics regarding various racialized communities where those statistics really don't analyze what they themselves mean for the people experiencing the outcomes. Instead, folks will simply point out that Black people don't have as much of this as white people, right? And everyone gets compared to the outcomes of white people. So is the aspiration for everyone to live the way white people do? No. We miss opportunities to champion and rally around the cultural value that we each bring through our various cultures and identity. The other sort of caveat that I want to offer before I go into my presentation is that we should be cautious, right, and critical of ourselves and of others who are claiming to strive for some version of an equitable outcome. Many times in history, we've seen three things happen. We've seen one where groups of people who are striving for equitable outcomes have their efforts undermined by people from within their groups. There's a story about the first documented planned rebellion of enslaved people in the United States and how that rebellion was thwarted by an enslaved person who went and informed the slave captors and the elected officials that the rebellion was being planned. The second thing that happens, which also we can tie all the way back to the Emancipation Proclamation, is that the institutions that govern us, right, the cities, the municipal agencies, the policies that govern us, will sometimes either intentionally or unintentionally incentivize discord, right? We incentivize racial tension, right? So it's important to remember that there are functions and factions at play that will work to continue to stir up conflict, interracial conflict, so that these objectives aren't achieved. And then the last thing that we see happen a lot in our work, those of us who do any kind of community engagement, is that either individuals or the institutions that they represent will make commitments to communities, right, to make them whole for trauma or harm that they've experienced throughout history, and then they never follow through with those promises. And one of the most famous instances of that is when the 20 pastors from Savannah, Georgia, were able to convince Abraham Lincoln to adopt some version of reparations for people who were being so-called freed from slavery. And instead, what we ended up with were reparations for the slaveholders for their loss of people when the slaves were freed, right? So a lot of times our equity efforts become procedural, and the outcomes of those efforts don't match the spirit that we said we were working within. Design build work has a very distinct legacy of harm that I find is not discussed enough in our work. And we could spend all day talking about this, but there are a couple of terms that I just want to make sure we know before we go into our discussion, right? So there's a process of racialization that happens in this country. We've heard of the word race, we've heard the word racism, but if I were to ask anybody here to define either of those terms, regardless of how specific you'll attempt to be, we will find that the rules, the systems, the processes, the social norms that make up those definitions are really messy and unclear. And I find, again, as a cultural anthropologist, that what is more important for us to be really well versed in is the process by which racial identities are assigned to us, right? And this happens through systems of oppression. It's not that I am not Black anecdotally, right? But what's really happening is I'm having a Black experience, right? I'm experiencing the world in a body that society has marked and labeled as Black. And the significance of that is only relevant when I am talking about what that experience is like. So really, it's easier for us to understand how racism and inequity work if we're able to understand how processes of racialization work. This legacy of slavery has shown up throughout time in many different ways, right? So after slavery, we saw sharecropping, and then we saw the Jim Crow laws, and then we started to see residential and educational segregation. We are still dealing with voter suppression, right? We are still dealing with housing and job discrimination. We are definitely still dealing with mass incarceration, and it's important to name these challenges as specific and direct outcomes of the legacy of slavery in this country. Other practices that are uniquely situated in the design build professions are redlining and purplining. Maybe a few of you have heard the term redlining, especially if you've been taking a series of engagement opportunities to learn more about equity. But I bet most of you have never heard of purplining. So redlining is, of course, the discriminatory practice of withholding access to housing and investments that lead to housing from specific neighborhoods. So it's a way to map processes of racialization, whereby the people who live in certain areas are characterized as undesirable because of their race, and later on in history because of how much money they had, right? And by virtue of those people being in that geography, the geography is now worth less. Purplining, though, is a theory that was developed by me, and we are continuing to develop it at the Thrivance Group. And it's really the transportation planning sector's iteration of redlining. Transportation actually had a direct hand in redlining, right? The automobile industry, the automobile insurance industry participated in that system, and so did the federal highway system. Its implementation reinforced those boundaries. But today, what we see through the exclusion of people from civic engagement processes is a dynamic that we call redlining, because usually, purplining, because usually the lines that folks are drawing on papers to outline their new transit routes and new bike lanes are purple. It's just what we do in our field. But what happens there is that certain neighborhoods and certain people within those neighborhoods are deemed not that they don't have value, but they're expendable in the process of developing or renewing a community. Speaking of urban renewal, a lot of people don't recognize that urban renewal stems from this process of redlining. When we hear urban renewal, a lot of us think that this is a positive term, right? We're renewing a community. But James Baldwin once referred to urban renewal as urban removal, right? And then later, Negro removal. Because essentially what happens is these policies and these programs that finance the renewal of our communities really outline the processes by which Black people are displaced and or their communities become underinvested in or divested from, so that investments can be pooled towards areas that are defined as more desirable for wider or wealthier people to inhabit. The experience that people have in areas that are undergoing urban renewal is called ghettoization, right? So this is where we start to see those borders, right, that popped up during redlining be reinforced through enforcement and through disinvestment, right? And the outcomes of that enforcement include mass incarceration, an inability to access healthy food options, so on and so forth. This also shows up in transportation planning through the use of low quality, temporary installations of transportation infrastructure that eventually break. And by eventually, I mean within a month of being installed, and become litter all across the street that never gets maintained. You may be wondering why I'm talking so much about the experience that Black people have had. That's because our country's story or origin of oppression is one that links all of our various struggles together. If you were to imagine where oppression comes from, who was the person sitting around came up with the idea of oppression? You ask yourself why. You would probably say, this person wanted power, or this person wanted influence, or this person wanted more resources, right? So this person is saying, what can I do to make myself distinct from everyone else, right? So that I can justify whatever actions I need to take in order to maintain or achieve or access power and resources. That process, that labeling people different as being different from you, is called othering, right? So when we name someone an other, we're saying there's something different about you, and I'm willing to use that distinction to justify my means to an end, which is power. Those rules and those messy systems and those unfair labeling processes get baked into what we call structures, systems, institutions that now take those beliefs and actualize them through processes, right? Now, if you were to ask yourself, way back in the day, what was probably the easiest and earliest form of othering, you would say, it's easiest to spot out people whose skin is different. You can't always tell what gender a person is, especially during times when we weren't as gendered of a society. And you can't always tell, how much money a person has by looking at them, but you know when a person's skin color and facial features are different. So anti-Blackness is very much a part of oppression's origin story. Okay, so all of the other versions of oppression are bound up in that history. You may have seen this spectrum before, but this is, a lot of people don't realize when we talk about slavery, when we talk about Jim Crow, a lot of times we think, oh, this was a very long time ago, we should be over it by now. But when you look at this on a continuum, on a literal continuum timeline, you'll see that we are very recent in our efforts to move away from the policies and institutions that created the outcomes we're working to resolve. In fact, in 1973, it was Ronald Reagan who completely gutted one of the earlier opportunities to ensure people had access to fair housing. He then doubled down and implemented a war on drugs, which was essentially a war on racialized people, where we found most of the men in the Black community and a majority of the men in the Brown community literally locked in cages for decades. Then we saw President Clinton adopt a policy called zero tolerance housing, where if at any point you were in federally funded housing and broke any rule, you would lose your housing and be criminalized. That practice continues today through the use of no-knock raids, which unfortunately is what killed Breonna Taylor. We are yet in the throes of the impacts, right, of slavery and the various forms of oppression that are part of the foundation of this country's history. So it's important not to go too far down the path of thinking that our work is reparative in that we're repairing something that used to happen. These are things that are still happening. So what does it mean, and I'm wrapping up, to have a reparative praxis? Well, there are five types of repair. There's restitution, right? There's compensation, which a lot of us advocate for. There's rehabilitation, which means changing what is happening. There's satisfaction, which these things are symbolic, right? These are apologies. And then there are guarantees. Here's the thing that I'm willing to do to guarantee this never happens to you again. So the work that we do at Thrivance Group, no matter what project it is, we are always taking a look at the interventions that we're recommending and the way that we do our work to make sure that these types of reparative pathways are included in what we do. We even have a 4-part litmus test where we're able to ask ourselves before we settle on or decide on a goal or a project, where we're saying, hey, are we addressing a specific type of harm for a specific type of person or community? And in doing so, are we creating some kind of additional or new process that is actually going to expand or create a barrier for folks, expand harm or create a barrier for folks? And then lastly, is what we're doing an opportunity to guarantee that this harm never occurs again? And is this temporary, or can this be sustained across multiple generations? So as we move into our discussion about equity and repair and the legacies of inequity in our work, I want you to keep that litmus test in mind. A lot of times we offer up solutions and don't realize that the solutions themselves could also contribute to expanding the harm that we seek to resolve. So on that note, I'm going to pass it back to Asheya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thomas. And I would like all of the panelists to turn on your cameras, and we're about to hop into the discourse related to equity in the built environment. And I think it was just really, really important for that history lesson, that contextual placement of kind of where we are now in 2022, and just have a baseline, particularly because of the SMPS audience in terms of marketing and business development professionals who work for various architecture, construction, engineering, and planning firms. We have to realize that the context of our day-to-day work, how we structure our project teams, who we hire, projects that we choose to pursue, all have a connective tissue to what Dr. Destiny just shared with us. And if we are really trying to change the course and the dynamic of where we move forward, of how we move forward, it's important to have kind of past this prologue and precedent. So I would like to invite each of our panelists to do a brief introduction of their background. We know that this is a heavy conversation and there is a lot of content that we would like to cover, and we've already had some conversation about possibly having a part 2 to this dialogue. So with that, I will have everyone kind of come on and introduce themselves, and I'll just go around. And as you're introducing yourself and your background, I'd love for you to share some background in terms of how has your life experience impacted your work, and potentially connecting that back to Dr. Thomas's presentation. So Henry, I'll have you go first, and then we'll go to Antoine and then Colette.
Thank you, Asheya. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Henry Nutt. I work for Southland Industries as a pre-construction executive, kind of slash BD role. So I kind of relate to some of you on this call today. I came from the field as the general superintendent for Southland for about 13 years, and been a sheet metal worker, still am, for the last 34 years. So I've kind of had the experience of the boots on the ground and installing work and working with people out there, and then running labor, into actually now selling work for Southland. I'm a recent author, so I've just written a book that was published in March. It's called 7 Principles, Creating Your Success in the Construction Industry, which is designed to help those folks who are trying to enter the industry that don't necessarily know how to navigate their way, primarily people of color and women, really trying to help empower people to be successful, and kind of taking my own story in my life's journey and how I've moved from the beginning till today, and wanting to share that with others. And so to answer your question in regards to how has my experience impacted my career, the one thing I think about is, on the negative side, there was this place in my life and my career where I had no confidence about my abilities. I was surrounded by people that did not look like me. I was typically the younger person in the group because I got into the trade very early. And so I went through many years of not really having confidence in my ideas, not having confidence sharing what I thought we should do in regards to how we approach a project. And I literally left the trade for a while. My father kind of got me into the trade. He was in the trade for years and retired from it. And so I left and came back with the mindset that I have to be different. I have to be better. I have to be my own cheerleader if no one else was going to be that. And so that was very courageous for me, because it still was that self-doubt inside. But I had to kind of break through that cycle, that mentality, and really begin to strategically speak my mind in different times. And that really led for me to open doors for me to be where I'm at today. It was my voice, it was my ability to recognize that my voice mattered in the space that I was in, and begin to share those kind of ideas. And so that kind of really empowered me to move forward, ultimately, get into the positions that I'm in, write a book about it, and hopefully share a story with others that they can relate to as well.
And as an aside, Henry is my counterpart for AGC in terms of leading their D&I efforts as well. So it's encouraging to see this industry-wide commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you, Henry, for joining us. Antoine?
Thank you, Asheya. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Henry. Look forward to working with you and everyone else during this panel discussion. My name is Antoine Bryant. I serve on the board of directors for the National Organization of Minority Architects as a director of strategic partnerships. That's where I first had the pleasure of meeting Asheya several years ago. And now, after several years in the community development, design, and urban planning space, now serve as the director of planning and development for the city of Detroit. I have been here for about a year now and been really excited about the projects that we have moving forward here in this phenomenal American city that is 79% African American. So many of the things that we're going to be discussing today, both historically as well as moving forward in the built environment, are certainly pertinent to what our residents are addressing on a day-to-day basis. Much of my past has been involved in how we address not only how we live, but where we live. I'm a native of Brooklyn. My parents both met there, and that's where I came about. And they instilled in me a long time the ability to, we all have a role that we can play to change our environment where we live. And led me to pursue a background in architecture and in urban planning. And I guess one of the things that I found most exciting, and it dovetails well with this conversation that your team has been having, is a series of workshops we had at Moody Nolan Architects about 2.5 years ago. That was very similar to this. For those that don't know, Moody Nolan is the largest African-American owned and led architecture firm in the country, over 300 employees, 11 offices. And after the murder of George Floyd, one of the things we discussed in-house in this organization that had 250 employees at the time, but only about 28% African-American, was that we have to be real about some of the racial challenges that exist in our city and in our country. And we have to talk about them and address them and kind of pull the onion away and start peeling away layers. And so I really appreciate the conversation to be with you all today and look forward to an inviting and hopefully provocative conversation.
Thanks, Antoine. Colette?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. My name is Colette Holt. I'm an attorney who focuses on minority, women, and disadvantaged business programs. I'm now based out of San Antonio, although I'm really a Chicago girl. And I got involved in these issues. I really started out life as a construction lawyer because I really wanted to be an architect, Antoine, but I had no talent. And I had the good sense to recognize that. But I got involved in minority business issues back in 1989 when I was an assistant corporation counsel for the city of Chicago. And the Richmond versus Croson case came down, and we realized that we were going to have to begin to create evidentiary records to support the need to address the lack of opportunities and barriers to minority businesses, particularly Black-owned firms. And I've been involved in these issues ever since. Certainly, I kind of came to this also because my father was a lawyer and did a lot of civil rights work, and my parents were very involved in some of the marches and whatnot in Chicago, including when Dr. Martin Luther King was almost murdered in Marquette Park, one incident people sort of forget about. But I think it's very important to have these conversations with the construction, architecture, planning, engineering, all the construction related services, because so much of what government spends is related to that. It's usually probably half an agency's budget. And these can often be great opportunities for people to build a career, build a business. I'm fascinated to Henry's story that he started out as a sheet metal worker and is still a sheet metal worker, and how that came to be about. So happy to be here and contribute anything to the conversation.
Thank you so much. So as you can see, we have a very well-rounded group to have today's conversation. I want to start off with the difference between architecture and planning. We have kind of a through line of, land acquisition and deciding what projects go where, and then a team is brought in to design it, and then a team is brought in to build it. And I think sometimes we get lost in understanding the community that those projects may impact and who makes the decision of what's going to go where. So I want to open the floor up to our group to just kind of give your own definition of the difference between architecture and planning and how that distinction is important to the built environment.
I guess I'll start, right? The guy that's the architect planner in the group. But one of the reasons I became interested in planning after pursuing architecture was architecture really focuses on the individual building. You're taught and you are designed to look at the context, the immediate context that the building serves in, but really you're focused on the design, which includes the art, as well as the structural elements of that particular entity, whether it's residential, multifamily, commercial, educational, what have you. When you're looking at urban planning or planning in general, it's a much more macro approach, right? And so it encompasses not only the actual building that it resides, but also the urban design of the fabric around it. It often takes into account the socioeconomic factors that exist for the residents of that immediate area. You're looking at demographic analysis. You're looking at social determinants of health. You're looking at the political realities of that area. And often looking at the economic nuances that allowed the area to come to be, especially when you divide it across the racial disciplines. And so when you're addressing planning, you're looking not only at the future, but you also have to take into account the victories and the challenges of the past, and allowing that to infuse and inform the moves that you make for the future. And in the best case scenario, planning should be very collaborative and should be engaging of the residents that you're planning with, as opposed to planning for. So those are some of the very quick kind of distinctions between architecture and planning.
Dr. Thomas, I feel like you want to chime in.
I thought that was a salient answer. The only thing that I would add to it is that planning is that's an idealistic description of what planning is, right? But really, what planning is an extension of policing and enforcement. It's an extension of border making. It's an extension of exclusionary zoning practices, right? So that's what planning is. Now, what does planning have the opportunity to be? It has the opportunity to be an interdisciplinary space. It has the opportunity to implement a cluster analysis, which allows us to arrive at a more holistic notion of not just how is land being used, but how can land be used. Given our history of racism and inequity in this country, we don't know the full potential of land use because we're still in an era of restrictive planning and restrictive zoning. And so I love the underscoring of in community engagement as a part of it. But planning is also policy making, policy advocacy, systems design, right, and systems destruction. I think all of that fits into the realm of planning. And as we look at the workforce that makes up the body of planners, um, how we define planning varies depending on your background, your lived experience, and what called you to the work.
Thank you for that. So as we're talking to our SMPS members about project selection, teaming opportunities, as we have looked at an individual project level, and we know that there's a team of consultants, subcontractors, subconsultants who make the work come to fruition, right? And we know that the lifeline of a potential project is at a minimum 3 to 4 years. And then by the time it's actually visible and occupied, it could be 7, 8, 10 years later, right? And so there are so many opportunities within that time spectrum. So I just want our group to kind of talk about opportunities on the whole spectrum of the project delivery and where there are easy wins for equitable opportunities in terms of developing the team, looking at your workforce, talking about some of those boots on the ground issues. Henry, I think you might have a good perspective here.
Yeah, thank you. So a couple of perspectives I have. One of kind of a lived experience in regards to some of the recent pursuits that we've had and been successful on is seeing how some of the owners that are taking more progressive approach to who they want on their projects, doing exhaustive research on the communities that they plan to build in. So they're going to build a $1 billion hospital in a community that suffers with poverty and crime and unemployment and lack of education or graduation rates in schools. And so doing a really thorough job at gathering these statistics, sharing that information, talking about health equity even, and bringing on partners. So when you look at, like, say, design build type project or progressive design build, where you're going to create a scenario where teams are linked together in the success or the failure of a project. And so we're trying to change the mindset on how we bring in those partners into a project that truly link up with the owner, the general contractor, and the team at large and the community to identify the areas that we need to impact and then how we're going to do it. It's not a map of saying, here's what you need to do. It's, if you're going to partner with us, I'll need you to explain to me how you're going to, what value do you bring in addition to your expertise as a contractor? What are you bringing to the table in regards to your staff, your team? What does that team look like? What kind of life experiences do they have? And show me beyond your words, through your experiences, how you're going to partner with us and bring value to this community. And so that requires a little bit more homework. That requires going a little bit deeper. It requires going beyond what we normally see as box checking exercises to go beyond that. It means that you literally have to have a team that has had some experiences in this space, not what we're going to do or what you've heard or read about. It's really, what is your company doing to bring value to this team to impact the community that is suffering in these ways? And so it really does require a committed effort for an owner to say, I'm going to draw a line in the sand and we're going to do something different. We're not going to allow a box checking exercise to happen. We're going to make sure that the people that enter to this project, not only were they going to have a great budget for the project, but they're going to have a great team that has proven that they can work in this space and be impactful and meaningful. And their leadership are going to be able to articulate those ideas and thoughts because of experiences beyond just, again, what someone has told them about. So it's a little bit more work. It requires a lot more, I guess I would say even courage, to step out in that way, to say we have to do something different. And that's what so many communities have seen and heard about. We're going to do this great project. And the only people that truly win are the people who take their money once they got the project and they go away. And the community is left in the same or not worse situation. And so we have to do better than that. But the only way that we really can drive that type of change are the people with the money. The owners have the money and the keys, and they can demand a better outcome, and they have to be willing to understand what that means. So hire some great consultants in the DEI space that can help you understand what that looks like. So I can go on forever, so I'll stop there.
Thanks, Henry. I think what's interesting, and you touched on it, is the tension between private projects, private development, and the decisions that those owners make versus municipalities and counties and government underscored projects, and the disparities that are obvious, right? In the public projects, there is more of a requirement and a push for equitable decision-making, equitable teams, at least diversity within those project teams. And those have various enforcement mechanisms versus on the private side where the owner can do what they would like to do. Colette, I'd like to have you hop in a little bit in this conversation because of your expertise talking about disparity studies and understanding what resources and firms are available in particular areas versus what requirements there are for projects, and just talk a little bit about that tension between public and private work.
Sure. And actually, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the public sector tends, not everywhere, but tends to be more likely to have some type of goals on projects. At the same time, however, and I primarily work on the government side, though not entirely, we are constrained by all sorts of constitutional and legal requirements. It's even starting with the most basic issues of if it's design, bid, build, it's going to probably be low bid, all the way up to the constitutional straitjackets that the federal courts have put us in, that I pretty confidently and sadly predict are about to get a lot worse. So we labor under all of those issues, but we do have goals and we do requirements, and by and large we're going to enforce them. And if you show up as the proposer, the construction firm, the design firm, whatever, and you didn't do what we asked you to do, you're not going to get the project. But the private sector doesn't have any of those constraints, but it also doesn't have any of those drivers. But in some ways, over time, I've come to think that the real action needs to be on the private side. One, because it's not so price driven. And one of the things that we certainly see, at least for minority-owned businesses, is that they often have a lot of trouble competing on price because they face barriers to credit, to networking, to all the things that help you to be low. And so on a private job, you can be much more creative. I can't put together a government program that says you must meet this goal because that's an illegal quota. But if it's my private project, I can make it very, very clear what my values are. And I expect you to meet them in those kind of creative ways that Henry was talking about. So it's both kind of good and bad. But I do think that for those of you that are putting together teams and are doing that marketing, it's absolutely critical that you really pay attention to exactly what program a government agency has. We see people make this mistake. I had a client yesterday who had a firm that says, well, we did it like this for a state of whatever. And I'm like, I don't care. That's not what's in our specs. So you didn't pay attention and they're not responsive. So really do follow those. They mean it. And don't just think that you can sort of, do now and ask for forgiveness later, because that's not going to work out.
How do you think marketing and business development professionals can help influence the process of procuring work? If we don't have the ear, particularly of the owner, but want to make sure that we are having diverse teams come to the table, and obviously making sure that at the end of the day, the community is also engaged. What's the opportunity there from architecture, construction, engineering firms on the marketing and business development perspective?
Well, I guess I'll jump in there first. I think that if you are on the marketing side, you really can make a good case for the fact that this is important to winning the work. So just sort of a crass business case for making sure that you're giving an owner, public or private, what that owner seems to value. I think there's also the research out there that suggests that diverse teams over time make better decisions because you have more inputs. And the national firms that I see, like Henry's and several others that are really growing out here and outstripping the competition, are bringing diverse teams to the table. So I just think as a practical business matter, you can make that case. But I think long-term for your organization to be healthy, to grow, to be competitive in this increasingly competitive environment, that bringing diversity to that becomes really a business strength for your organization.
Yeah, if I can add to that, this business is about relationships, no matter where we go. We do all this with people every day, all day. And one of the things that I see in this industry, and I think most people on this call, if you've been in the construction industry for any length of time, you understand that innovation is key to our success. We can't stay doing the same thing that we've done 10 years ago and think that we're going to be competitive and be on the job or the next job. And so this is just another avenue or leg of innovation. And if you understand relationships in this business, we have had opportunities to talk with whether it's a GC or an owner about an RFP process before a job is even being considered, or maybe it's being considered at a very high level. What is that RFP? What should that look like? They'll call us and ask us questions about strategies and how to correctly craft an RFP that may streamline the criteria that they want, at the same time being fair. So you can have those kind of conversations with folks at your level in that marketing or business development role, where you can influence how RFPs are going to be drafted. And so that criteria, again, can be progressive, it can be innovative, it can help bring those right players to the table, or help course correct those who aren't going to be. So there's different ways of having that conversation and making it, again, a part of the job criteria without it seeming unfair. But those conversations have to happen early, and those are built on the relationships that you may have established. And so that trust is very critical in that. So those are some things that I see happening now, and that can continue to work.
One thing that I've seen working with our clients is that a lot of times the barrier of time can be a barrier for MWBE firms. If they're a smaller shop and the RFP is asking for, 5 projects in the last 5 years that equally match this exact specification. If you're a small shop, you might have 2 projects for 5 years and only one of them meets that criteria. So again, that lens of influencing what the requirement, that also carries over as people are hiring as well. It's like you've got this job description for this position that requires 1,000 years of experience, and you want it to be a mid-level career. Like it just doesn't add up, right? And so, Antoine, I think you were about to jump in with Henry's conversation as well.
There's some great commentary about my colleagues here, so it's very exciting to have this conversation. I was just going to push back a bit, even on the question regarding the influence that the marketing team has on the owners. I think that they have a lot more influence than we want to give themselves credit to. Oftentimes, the marketing professionals are cheek by jowl with the owners and of most of these clients and most of the conferences and most of those spaces. In my previous institution, I did business development as well. And you had the opportunity to engage owners at every course. And so one of the things, and this kind of goes back to Colette's point, Scott Page wrote a number of books about the diversity bonus and how working with diverse teams there's a strong value proposition for it. And so we have to just totally upset the apple cart about this narrative that entities that don't have diverse teams are the strongest ones. You need to be much more intentional about ensuring that you have inclusion on all of your teams. There was a question on the Q&A about how early do you approach DE&I in your procurement process. And what I would say is that I would revisit that question entirely and say, why is it something that you have to make a part of your process? Right? If you want to have an excellent process and if you want to have excellent teams, then you have to have inclusive teams as a part of that. And I think we need to get away from this. Should I, think about DEI here or think about it here? And that goes back to Henry's point. I cannot, as a municipal entity, explicitly state that every winning team has to have inclusive members. However, every team that's won a project in my office has had inclusivity as part of their membership. Now, you can read it all any way you want, but I'm gonna tell you that's what's gonna happen when it comes to the city of Detroit. And I think that's something that we have to be very intentional and unapologetic about. There is excellence in all the disciplines that we're looking for. I also push back on the narrative of sometimes there's not nearly enough experience. That is a reality amongst our minority quote unquote firms, but it's a reality on majority firms too. And so one of the things we need to start highlighting is quality and the strength of experience as opposed to quote unquote the length of experience. And if we're able to take flyers on various other teams, then we need to do the same level of availability for teams of color. And then the last thing I would do is really, because I was, I've worked as not only personally as a small vendor, but worked as an organization that was huge, but also was minority led, was the opportunity of partnering. And so allowing a number of our MBEs to join together for a project here, a project there, to show combined expertise, and then allow that to be the driver on that application. And so that's a space that we need to be much more intentional to promote, as well as we continue to ensure that there are opportunities for vendors of color.
Yeah, I'll jump in here with just one more thought, and that is, if you are the marketing person, or business development, whatever your title might be, start looking for your diverse partners long before you need them. It is very difficult as a small firm to be hyper responsive. I mean, we're tiny, we're about 15 people, and we manage, but a lot of people wouldn't be able to do that. And so then it becomes woven into the fabric of what you do and what you bring. Because to Ms. Warren's point about, small firms just can't respond in 4 or 5 days, that won't work if you haven't already done the legwork to find those partners and help to nurture them. So if I go to the city of Detroit and I say, I have a diverse team, I've worked with them on other projects, so it isn't just this pick them up and put them down kind of scenario. And here's what I'm doing to help those smaller firms to grow. Here's our mentoring plan. I don't know, I can't speak for the city of Detroit, but I've sure worked with a lot of cities. I know that would be very important to us. And so you can do that independently of any particular solicitation, because by the time it hits the street, it may be too late to be able to do all that legwork.
And can I add something really quickly on this? Because we are a small firm, and I think what we encounter often is that the relationships become very transactional very quickly once the project has been awarded. And so in addition to being thoughtful about how you form a team, thinking about changing your systems and processes in your own operations to support the fact that you now have small minority-owned businesses on your docket, right? So having a pay when paid clause is not ideal for an entity that can't front $150,000 worth of work for 6 months. Not being willing to attribute an invention or an idea to a person because they're not high up on your team's org chart, when you know that without their expertise and lived experience and trauma, you would not have come up with that idea, is really problematic. So new ways of working have to accompany these new teaming structures as well, so that we're not perpetuating harm and putting people out of business.
I think that's a good segue to a question that was just posed in the chat, particularly about mentorships and mentorship programs at the corporate level between companies our mentorship programs providing barriers, removing barriers, or providing opportunity for partners that they're nurturing, right? So that could be in a joint venture sort of scenario, or it could be a mentor protege program. Certainly there's opportunities for exposure for larger firms, right? For smaller firms to see through at a larger firm, but are there really valuable opportunities that stem from mentor protege type programs?
Well, I guess I'll jump in here for a second since I'm kind of the one that brought it up. There can be. It all depends how they're structured and what the objectives are. You know, and a joint venture relationship is different than a mentor protege relationship, might be different than a teaming relationship. So, you know, people use terms differently, but there certainly can be. The most effective ones that I've seen have been in two different types of firms. One is engineering firms, where it's a much smaller firm that really does learn from the very large firm about how to put proposals together, how to interface with the client, invoicing, getting those relationships, and where there really is not the competitive threat. And I think we just have to be honest about that. If you're a 100-person engineering firm, you're not going to mentor a 20-person firm because they're right on your heels. But if you're AECOM or Jacobs or something, I pick on my own clients here, you know, some small firm is not a threat to you in this lifetime. So I think that matters. The other place where I've seen them be reasonably successful is in the heavy highway industry, where you know, learning how to build a road is just something that's got to be taught. And I have seen some successful programs at state departments of transportation. On the private side, they get loosey-goosey really fast. And there's nothing wrong with going to lunch. I'm all for that. But I do think, especially for the smaller firm, for the mentee, know what your objectives are and insist that you get them. And if that's not working, then you need to end that relationship. You know, it isn't just to make somebody else look good.
100%. I think on the private side is really up to, you know, there's a position of power that if an opportunity is posed to an MWBE firm that a project needs them, there's a position of power there in which you can say what your needs are, right? And demand that those needs get met in terms of the relationship, as opposed to just having one position on an org chart, right? Like you have some more capital there that you can leverage to get what you need to out of that relationship to move to the next level. And I think we have to start looking at reciprocal relationships in terms of teams and structures and project opportunities. And I don't know that we look far enough down the road to think about that from a strategic perspective. One thing that we haven't touched on yet in our conversation is civic and community engagement related to our projects. I know particularly on the public side, if there's a transportation project or a large hospital project, a lot of our community engagement outreach tends to be for diverse suppliers, right? So there's a twofold conversation. There's supplier diversity, but then there's also true community engagement about the end users of a school, a college, a hospital, a transit system. Can we dig a little bit into what community engagement looks like, and then think about, from a marketing and business development perspective, how our firms can be more involved in that process?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. So one of the things that we're doing here at Southland is with regards to workforce development. Who are the people who are going to build the jobs? And then the excuse could be whether the people don't exist. So there are many programs in different cities around the country, obviously, that have pre-apprenticeship programs that are very viable, that are very effective. And they partner with the local unions, they partner with whoever is in the area that needs their services. And so we've partnered with several that have done that, where we'll come in and do workshops with their students and essentially spend a day with them and build a product, get them an opportunity to touch and feel soldering or knocking ductwork together, kind of like what is a day in the life, talk to some of the field leadership about what it would look like for them to be successful on a project. And so you get involved with them, and there's a couple of things that I think I almost call it, it's like the magic happens, is when we get in that room with these students that have the same drive, the same ambition, they may not have the skill set yet, but they have the desire. And what happens to our folks that go to these different types of events is they get to see sometimes their own biases exposed and recognize that they are biased, and begin to see people that don't look like them, may not think like them, but are just as smart and just need an opportunity. And they get a chance to be challenged with that or confronted with their own biases, and recognize that exists in them, and begin to have a little bit more humility and empathy for people that just looking for an opportunity, not charity, but an opportunity. And so we get a chance, we've seen our field leadership, and then one of our superintendents just has taken this on, where I used to do this, has taken on this role of just leading the effort when it comes to workforce development, and just bringing in an arsenal from our team to go in and create opportunities for people that we've hired and have kept to this day for years. And so it really has not only has it helped the people get a job, but it also has helped transform the mindsets of my own people in our company by just going through the experience of working in a program like this. So again, it's not something that you can just read and hear and see somebody do. You have to be involved and entrenched in it yourself, and then hire this person, and then you get to see, oh wow, they can do the job just like I can. And maybe it's unfortunate that it has to be that process, but that's what it is. And so we get to see that, and I've got to see many of our people be transformed in how they think about the workforce that doesn't look like them. And then they get a chance to really connect with that, and it becomes commonplace, where that bias really just begins to just kind of shed away. And so it's a real organic kind of process, but it's one way that we've seen create that type of engagement that's long lasting.
Thanks for that. Antoine, did you have any perspectives on community engagement?
Plenty. One of the things that I've shared with our staff is the premise of being actually a part of the community that you're serving. And the basic premise of that is early and often. And so our staff will go to community events that are not sponsored by the city of Detroit, right? So oftentimes, especially in planning, but also with a lot of departments, we'll go to a community when we're hosting something, right? When we're hosting a meeting, or when we're trying to get feedback on a project, or when we're trying to fulfill a report for some fiduciary purposes. And residents know that, right? Residents get it. And so I think it's been much more effective in my career, and we're having some success here when you go to the community when they're having their events, right? You go to the block club meetings, you go to the neighborhood association meetings, you go to the block parties, you go to the events that are already there, but then you also actively go to the neighborhood, right? Go to the juke joint, go to the barbershop, go to the, whatever, go to the bar that's in the area, so people know you. And people really will believe that you have a vested interest in seeing the success of that community. I've joked with many people, the first 4 months I was here, I just went to different parts of the city to try to understand what people thought about the city. And normally I would just sit someplace and just kind of hang out. Invariably somebody would come up to you and want to know, hey, what are you doing here? My name is Antoine. Where'd you go? I just moved to Detroit. Well, what do you do? Oh, I work for the city. Let me tell you about the damn city. And then people, everyone has their city narrative, right? Everyone has one. But it allowed me an opportunity to hear from people literally from all across the city at every walk of life, but also then to be able to appreciate definitively where people are coming from. And I wasn't doing it to write a report or to write a thesis or to fulfill a data mining exercise, but really to make sure that I understood where people are coming from. And I think that's when you have successful engagement, that's what that's supposed to be. I think many of us, and well, I'll say it, I'm the old man on the panel, we remember when it was called community outreach, right? And, basically it was literally a one-way form of dialogue. And now that we're actually using engagement, it's meant to be a dialogue, but I think it's only true if we're actually listening. And unfortunately, many of us are speaking and we're not doing enough listening.
I just jump in and add one thing. I think that's absolutely right. What you're saying is that you have to be somehow, I'm not sure careful is the right word, but cognizant maybe, or sensitive to, who really speaks for a community. Certainly, I think in government, you can get all sorts of people coming down to a meeting saying, I speak for the community. And really they speak for like them and maybe two other people. And I think it can be easy to make mistakes that way if you are new to a community or your firm is not very well versed or integrated into that community. And I don't really have any good advice for people about how to weed out the people who are in there jumping up and down and screaming, mostly for themselves, versus people who truly have the voice of the community and have that grassroots basis. So I don't really have a good way to tell you how to do that, except to maybe do what Antoine is doing and just get out there and start listening to people. Because we do interviews with focus groups and minority firms and stakeholders as part of disparity studies. And I probably interviewed easily over 2,000 people by now. And you'd be surprised how many people claim to speak for the Black contractors who aren't contractors and really don't speak for anybody. And you can get misled. So I'm not sure how to do that any better. I don't know if any of the other panelists have a thought about that.
Yeah, one of the things I think about with that, Colette, I think is a great point, and that's the beauty of diversity of thought, and it's the beauty of diversity. There are blind spots that exist in all of us, and that's why we need diversity. Whether it's brown, Black, gender, whatever it may be, it's that you can't expect to know everything, no matter how intelligent you are and your lived experiences. We have blind spots, and that's why we want people in that don't look like us and have had different life experiences to be a part of our team, to be able to identify those blind spots and bring a holistic point of view, of perspective. And so many times we have people that come in and, like you said, Colette, speak for the masses, and they really are for themselves, and they're misinterpreting half the information because they don't get it. In many ways, they can't get it. And then we go and honor the whole thing. Well, you don't know what you don't know. And I've learned to really despise that term, because it's not an excuse to remain ignorant. And that's where we need people that can help expose those types of issues that we may have. And it takes someone to have courage, or you hiring someone to help you as a company understand where you're failing and be able to give you that harsh truth so that you can do better. So it really comes down to recognizing that, you know what, I know I'm not the right person for this, but you have to have some humility to come to that place. And so we need leadership in that way, where company leaders are recognizing that I don't have the talent. I need to go out. We have to go hire somebody that can help us holistically bring us to the place we need to be to make better decisions. Because what we're doing now, it's not working. Let's look at the data. It's not working. So there's opportunities there, but we have to take those risks or understand that so we can make better decisions. And that's where I see we can we have some room to grow there.
And Henry, as you're talking about kind of workforce development, I just want to underscore the fact that we have to be thinking about this both internally and externally. So if we do this external, effort for workforce development and recruit and hire and bring new voices into organizations who are not heard or not given the ability to thrive in those organizations, they're going to leave. And so we're going to have an attrition rate and be back at the same point where we started. And so we just have to have this DEI conversation all the way through the whole built environment line, from firm establishment to who your workforce is, to how you're engaging with the community. And I think we're going to just continue to plant these seeds along the way. Dr. Thomas, were you about to chime in with something?
I would only add to the community engagement discussion, because I'm the queen of community engagement. That's what I call myself. But I would only add that it's important to make sure we have intentional inputs and on-ramps for the engagement that's happening. And what I mean by that is you can have wonderful relationships with the community. They can love you and participate in your processes. But if you're not able to identify where all of their input and priorities and wants and needs are showing up in your project and its outcomes, then it's performative. And I think in addition to that, I love the idea of, doing engagement all the time and not just project specific engagement. But to that end, seeing the folks who are in the communities showing up to these engagement processes as technical partners and not the community, other or separate from the work you're doing. And so resourcing their insight the same way you would resource a sub-consultant who has a sociological background, right? And making sure that you are redistributing power through that relationship with the community so that in the future, the community doesn't have to wait for a project to get funded or for your firm to come along to open a door for them to talk to implementers and decision makers and elected officials about what's important to them. So it's also an important capacity building exercise that, again, can't say this enough, includes considering a staffing mechanism for their input on your project.
I think that's huge. So we have about 5 minutes left. And so we were right on our prediction about how quickly this time would go. Antoine, go ahead.
I mean, you wasting time telling us how much time we got. No, I'm playing. No, one thing I wanted to address. There was an inquiry about memberships and about how we continue to get access to organizations and to these other entities. I will definitely, and I encourage us all, I will definitely put a plug for NOMA. What we've often had, we're in the built environment on a regular basis, and our membership is built up of architects, designers, interior designers, planners of color, almost exclusively. And what we've often had is that entities and other organizations will attend the conference, and they're usually blown away because they will never, ever, ever have another opportunity to see 900, 1,000, 1,100, 1,200 architects and designers of color all in one place. And so, that's an opportunity for you to capitalize on that and be able to establish those relationships, not only with firms, but also with students. One of the times we have a student competition. We often put all of their work up at our host venue. And I cannot tell you how many times we've had large firms ask us which firms are showing their work. How come we didn't get to show our work? And we're like, no, that's the work of Illinois Institute of Technology, or that's the work from Tuskegee, or that's the work from Cornell, or that's the work from Howard. And many of the professionals are blown away to see the capacity and the excellence that's exhibited there. And so I would encourage participation not only at the national conferences of these organizations, but also at an affiliate level or some other sponsorship opportunity in organizations like a NOMA, like a NSBE, like a SHPE. They all exist, and all will give you an on-ramp to those staff and to those students as well.
Thank you for that. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I'd like to see us take. One of them was related to building DEI within an organization, which is a really broad topic. One thing that I will recommend is Construction Inclusion Week is occurring in October. Several leading firms have come together, and this is the second year. Henry and the AGC are in alignment with that effort. And so there is a DEI maturity model framework just so that your firm can see where you currently are, that's available in that process, so that you can actually start to begin to do that work. And then again, I would like to underscore the efforts that SMPS has generated. In the fall, you will see an inclusive language guide coming out that we have done specifically for marketing and business development as you're responding to proposals. There are several curriculum pieces coming out in terms of what chapters can provide. So I think it's a wide open space if you're really ready and willing to do this work. So I'll pass it around for closing remarks from each of our panelists before we hop off. And if there are other questions that come up in the chat, we'll see if we can squeeze them in. Destiny?
It's hard to give closing remarks first, but I will say that one of the toughest lessons that I had to learn as a young person who was and am still really passionate about social justice issues was the time it takes to really see meaningful change in society, and also the difficult things that you learn about yourself and how you need to grow and change and transform. And so I just want to encourage folks who are maybe just stepping into this space to rely on people who've been doing this work for a long time to help form new ideas, but also be gentle with yourself and develop a circle of practice or a community of accountability so that you have someone other than yourself and even other than these, DEI spaces, to help correct course when you're missing the mark. You got to have someone from the community that has access to you and can tell you when you're causing harm and not healing it. So that's my last bit of advice there. Also, you can find me at Dr. Des, the planner, on Twitter. You can visit us at thrivencegroup.com. And please be on the lookout for the rollout of our 501c3 arm this fall.
Colette.
I guess I'm just very excited about this cross-disciplinary conversation. I mean, I've been talking about these issues for over 30 years, and it's quite refreshing to see the marketing and business development people talking to someone from a very large general contractor design build firm, and then an architect. We got a lawyer, we have a sociologist. So I think that's really important that DEI, is sort of the flavor of the month right now. And in terms of trying to sustain that, to have these interdisciplinary conversations, I think is very important so that we all get a sense of what is going on sort of outside our little silos. And so I want to thank you all for putting this together. I think this is very exciting. I definitely think we should have round two. If you're interested in sort of following all of this from a legal perspective, because I am a lawyer, so that's how I'm going to approach almost everything. You can follow me on Twitter at MWBE Law, so Minority Women Business Enterprise Law, and you can catch me there as well. So thanks for having me.
Thanks. Antoine.
Pleasure to be here. I want to thank Asheya for gathering this merry band of misfits together and having this conversation. Definitely wants to encourage us all that we have an opportunity to make a difference. Too often we've had this, I'm only an architect, or I'm only a business professional, I'm only a marketing person. What can I do to make a difference? And I think each of us has the capacity and ability to make a impact in the circle that we move in. And so I want us to continue to think in that realm. I do believe that there is space, not only in EDI. I appreciate Colette's approach. We've been having, some of us have been talking about this stuff way before it was a code word, right? And now in NOMA, we've had a number of our young professionals that have pivoted, and instead of calling it EDI, they call it JEDI. And they say we can't have anything moving unless we have actually justice when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So they use a JEDI model, which I think is very appropriate. And so I want us to think about it in that capacity, and then also look at the many different ways we can approach it. One of the reasons why I was excited to serve in municipal government, which has its own challenges, was to be able to have someone that was sensitive to these kinds of issues and be able to push and continue to do so. And so that's why I serve in the capacity that I am. I'm easy to find. Asheya has all my information. I've had many of my colleagues say I need to update my social media presence, so that's coming soon. My bad, but you'll be able to find Antoine, Bryant, Bryant, like Kobe, shortly, coming soon. So thank you for that.
Henry, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, just I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because there are panels like this with the panelists here, a bunch of smart folks that have a passion and care about this topic, about people. I get an opportunity as being a board member of AGC and being on the steering committee nationally in California to see so many people, so many conversations of all types of people coming together to really strategize on how do we really move this needle in a very authentic way. So I'm very hopeful. I think sometimes light shines the best in dark places. And I put the optimistic side of me speaks that kind of analogy because it is dark, but there's still light. And so as we move forward in this space and continue to do these types of events and have the conversations, we're only going to have a better impact and get more people involved in this dialogue. So I'm hopeful. I'll leave it with that.
Thanks, Henry. I just want to remind everyone that the presentation materials will be available on the SMPS website under smps.org/DEI. And we will be back with you soon with another conversation and hopefully round 2 of this one. So thank you for your time today, and we look forward to connecting with you in the future. Bye, everyone.